Morning. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I run the Energy and National Security Program here. We're very pleased to have all of you here today on the Monday after Halloween. Hopefully you all got more treats than tricks. We're very pleased to have you here today for a discussion of emerging market dynamics and the global energy outlook. For those of you who frequent our events and read our commentaries, you know that we are very focused on the intersection between policies, markets, and technology. In particularly, what's going on with oil markets over the last several years, year and a half. At the beginning of last year, we put out several pieces that sort of tried to frame what we thought was going to be happening in the preceding, at that point we didn't really know, 9, 12, 18 months period of time in global energy markets, which was a number of really important questions. One, what was happening on the supply side? What were the supply elasticities of new types of oil and, quite frankly, natural gas and other energy technologies that are on the market? And how did they respond to different price levels over a period of time? Two, what was happening with financial markets and how were a lot of these energy technology or resource endeavors being funded by different capital market dynamics and things that were going on that side of the equation? And three, sort of what were the geopolitics of it all? Was this really a race for market share? Was it somebody trying to influence one country versus another? How did that all shake out? And so we spent a lot of time focusing on those things. Today is actually one of the first events where we're looking at a very important component piece that we've not actually seen people do a lot of work on. What is happening in emerging markets? Given the fact that what's happening in emerging markets is so very important to not only the near and medium term price development in the energy market and the oil market space, but also the longer term energy outlook that we all share and use. And so we put together an all-star panel of folks to do that and talk through some of those issues today. So I'm very pleased that you guys would all be here to join us. And we are webcasting, so please keep in mind that the event is on the record and will be available later for downloading and watching. Today we're going to kick off our conversation with Joyce Chang. And Joyce comes to us from JP Morgan, where she's the managing director and the global head of research at JP Morgan. When we looked for the go-to expert on emerging market issues, Joyce was the number one name that came up with every expert that we hold in high esteem. So we find ourselves very lucky to have her here today. We also have Daniel On here today, who's a senior advisor to the Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of State. For those of you who don't know, it's a very new position, the Chief Economist at the Department of State, adding a lot of important work and insight into the economic statecraft work that is going on at the Department of State and helping to analyze a lot of what's going on out there in the diplomatic world, but from an economic perspective. And then finally, we've got Catherine Wolfram, who's the faculty director at the Energy Institute at Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Catherine, we were lucky to meet Catherine through our friend Alulu from the Energy Information Administration. And Catherine's going to focus a little bit on the longer-term relationship between development and GDP growth rates in lesser developing and developing economies and energy demand. Whereas Joyce is going to focus on some of the headwinds and the tailwinds facing emerging markets, and Daniel's going to talk a little bit about the low oil price environment and its impact on oil exporting economies within that emerging market sector. So each will have a presentation, and we're going to go through the presentations and then have a bit of a discussion. So please join me in thanking and welcoming our panelists today. And you can use just the down arrows to advance. Just the down. Yep.
So this one to this one.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation, and it's great to be here with Dan and with Catherine. So I thought I would start with a few slides on the emerging markets. Oops, that did not quite work.
Oh, it didn't.
The down did not. Oops, let me just... Sorry about that. Okay, so can just use the side. Okay. So, okay, thanks. Okay, so I thought I would just start with the emerging markets forecast and talk about where we are in the emerging market cycle. So you think about emerging markets, there's really 3 C's to remember: China, commodities, and capital. So what has shifted in emerging markets? Over the last 10 to 15 years, you really had 3 trends that were in emerging markets' favor that very rarely for emerging markets align. The first was the terms of trade, the very favorable terms of trade and the commodity cycle. The second was the very, very cheap capital for emerging markets, which I would argue is still there, but you have financial conditions that are more difficult right now. And the ample liquidity. We're beginning to see signs of that turning. So where are we forecasting emerging markets growth this year? We have emerging markets growth at only 3.3%. That is more than a full percentage point below potential. It is actually the worst emerging markets growth performance in about 15 years. And it's also the smallest differential that we've seen between developed market growth and emerging markets growth in many years. We have the developed markets growing at just under 2%, and we're looking at 2% next year. We are in the camp that thinks that the Fed will do a small move in December, and they've signaled that. We also think, though, you're going to see more QE coming out of the European Central Bank in December, and we think you'll see more QQE coming out of the BOJ as well sometime next year. So I think that even though you do see a Fed liftoff, this is not the liftoff that we would have talked about in 2013. I think it's going to be very slow. We only have 10-year Treasury yields at this time next year at about at under 2.5%, at like 2.4, 2.45%. But if you take a look at this picture, what stands out? First, you have Latin America in recession. And what's most noteworthy is that we are forecasting a 2-year recession for Brazil. We have Brazil contracting nearly as much as Russia this year and contracting another 2% next year. If you take a look at emerging Europe, so both in Latin America and emerging Europe, we're growing below the US and Europe. In emerging Europe, because of the Russia contraction, we're actually even tracking below this very relatively modest European recovery. But we do have Russian growth stabilizing next year. So even though the concerns are about hard landing in China, we still see that Asia is the relative bright spot when we look at the overall emerging market story. On China, we are not in the camp that forecasts a hard landing. And what I would point out is that the Chinese economy has had a 2-speed growth really in the last few years, going back all the way till 2010. So the traditional indicators in manufacturing, we think, underestimate overall economic growth. The macro indicators point to much slower industrial activity, and this has been the case since 2010. But what we've seen is actually very stable consumption trends, and that services continues to grow as a share of the economy. But we do see China, slowing down from where it's been. But 6.9% growth, in my opinion, is not a hard landing. We have China at 6.8% growth next year. But we think the services sector is going to continue to outperform for the foreseeable future, and probably 7 to 8% growth in the services sector in China. So turning now to look at the impact of China on the rest of the world, because I think this is key to understanding the emerging market story. We estimate that every 1 percentage point GDP shock in China takes about half a percentage point off of global growth. But the impact varies widely, and the impact on developed market countries is only 0.2% over a 4-quarter period. It's only 0.1% for the United States, but it's 0.4% for Europe and Japan, which have much more of their exports directed to China. But if you take a look at emerging markets, because of the commodity mix, you can see that this is almost nearly a 1-to-1 correlation. Take a look at Latin America, even compared to emerging Asia, which is more of a commodity importer. Now, I would say, though, that does this look disastrous for all of global growth? Remember that you've had a downshift in all of global growth. So the China's share of growth has actually been pretty stable. China's share of global output has kept its contribution to global growth remarkably stable, because output has consistently increased. So China has consistently been about 1/3 of global GDP growth since 2011, even at these lower growth rates coming down from double-digit growth. Remember that if the impact varies by country, because only 2.5 percentage points of global GDP is exported to China. So a China shock on direct trade is relatively limited. What you really need to look at is China final demand. And that's more important for the closest neighbors and the emerging markets countries. And I think many emerging markets countries were counting on China demand being there, and there's nothing that replaces that. The demand from developed countries, their own domestic demand, is not replacing that. So I think you are looking at below potential growth numbers for emerging markets growth in the near future. But let's take a look now at actual energy demand. And one of the big oil market surprises, I think you'll hear from the other panelists this year, was demand. One of them on the back of lower prices, that we actually had much stronger demand than we had thought. But look at where China is. It's even higher than the US. So according to BP figures, then you've got Russia, India, and you've got Germany and Brazil pretty even as well. This has become an emerging markets demand story. So understanding the emerging markets growth outlook is very important. But we've seen stronger than expected demand this year, and lower OPEC output that have resulted in a tighter balance in our own forecast. So we see actually some upward revisions to demand, that OECD countries have consumed more as demand has come down. We've also had upward revisions to Indian demand. If you go back to that first chart on GDP growth, we actually have India growing soundly above China for the first time, and around 7.8 to 8% growth over the next couple of years. So this year, we are expecting oil demand growth of 1.7 million barrels per day. And in 2016, we're forecasting 1.24 million barrels per day next year. But the surprise this year, I think when everybody looks back on 2015, was the stronger oil demand. Now let's break this down by what this means for the commodity complex at large. And this chart really shows you the extent to which China was a key driver for commodities demand. And if you take a look at certain things like iron ore, it's almost one-to-one. It's like 60% of the demand for iron ore is from China. So that has direct implications for a country like Brazil, for example. If you look at where they were actually sourcing their resources, has implications for Australia. It's not just an emerging market story. If you take a look at copper, China has been more than 40% of the demand for copper. So that has implications for many of the developed markets and the commodity currencies as well, where we've seen weakness as well. But you can see that the world is feeling the pain. It's more than just an emerging market story. And a lot of people ask us, how do we track what's happening in China? Well, I always tell them, we look at the fixed asset investment, but look at how closely that is tracking commodity imports. But fixed asset investment has been a standard bearer for tracking the state of the Chinese economy, and that has had a very, very strong correlation with the commodity import volume that we've seen in China. And that goes back, this chart goes back all the way to 2008. We've also tried to look at that, what would happen for every 1 percentage point increase higher in China's growth as far as the demand for commodity exporters and for commodity importers. And this just gives you an idea of the overall trend. China has just come out with an update on its economic objectives. We do think that one of the things you could see is that their official growth target over time comes down to 6%. But I'm not that negative about China. I remember 2 years ago, everybody said, look, the US recovery, it has to be 3.5 to 4%. Now everybody has learned to live with a 2.5% US recovery. The European recovery is seen as a success story at 1.5% to 2%. So in a couple of years, will we get to a point where everybody takes a look at China and they say that, look, 5% in China is not necessarily a disaster? Again, though, I think the problem was many emerging markets were counting on a much higher growth number. So one trend that's very interesting to take a look at is that China's diesel exports are actually running about 5 times higher than the levels a year ago. Now, a lot of people have asked, what does this mean? First of all, there is a demand for bigger cars, and with the two-child policy now, you're going to see those days of a small car, in China, they're going to go the way of the rest of the world. But we're also seeing that the product export quotas have been raised for Chinese refiners. And if you look at exports from August to December, we think that actually could be up about 44% versus the first 7 months of the year. So deliberate policy actions on China's side, but also just, I think, greater demand just given the consumption trends in China going forward. So we are looking for China to slow further and for India to hold up. India has had much higher than expected oil demand. It was actually, if you look at the September data for India, it was close to 15%. The weak monsoon rains actually led to a pickup in diesel consumption for power generation in India. But we do think that India will be able to hold onto these types of growth numbers. I think that India has managed to really keep investors' interest without doing that much, just by simply not having anything that bad going on and having a policy mix that is more predictable, leaders who are in front of the market participants. So they have, just by not having anything bad happen, managed to keep, I think, very strong market sentiment. But you can see the differential between China and India's growth, and you can also see our forecast for the broader emerging Asia growth. So let me just talk a little bit more about China growth. I do think that the growth measurement problem is overblown. And if you take a look at just the key things that we're looking at, we're really looking at the services sector as a share of the economy. And you can see this much more clearly in the next slide. But take a look, services over 50% of GDP, industry coming down to 40%. If you only look at the industrial data, it only tells part of the story. And this is a trend that you can really see, and they've been articulating these goals for years, really picked up in 2012, like after 2010, where they said it's no longer these massive stimulus packages, we're rebalancing the economy, we're going to a more higher end services, with the objective of higher incomes for the population, improving the standard of living. So there is a real differential between looking at the services sector versus manufacturing. And just to briefly review the objectives that came out of the fifth plenum communique that was released just last week, the objective is to double the size of GDP and per capita income between 2010 and 2020. So they did the mid-year report. So what are the 5 major themes that we'll hear more about? Innovation, setting up creative enterprises, new businesses by the general public, the whole Made in China 2025, nurturing new strategic industries, more coordinated development, green policy, openness, and inclusive growth. But this is what a rebalancing does. Now, if we take a look then at the near term and structural challenges, those are also immense. And I think this prevents a major stimulus package from being introduced. So over the medium term, whether China is going to be successful will be determined by their progress with structural reforms. So what are China's problems right now? High corporate debt. You have a high real lending rate in the economy. You have a slowdown in the nominal GDP growth, and you have weaker corporate profits. And that means that I think some of these concerns about financial stability will be with us for some time to come. And if you ask me, what are the key things to watch in China right now? I'm less worried about the slowdown than the unwind of the carry trade. So what's the China carry trade? So Chinese corporates had been able to borrow cheaply overseas, as many entities had been able to at 2%. They were able to put it in their own interbank market and earn 6% or 10% in a wealth management product. And since there had been no devaluation since 1994, many of these trades were levered up 4 or 5 times. I mean, no devaluation for 21 years. Well, you had the devaluation. We think that the devaluation will need to resume at some point next year. We have 6.7 for the renminbi a year out. Not a huge weakening, but given the overall backdrop of weaker emerging markets FX, we don't think that China will necessarily stand still. The good news that I think about half of this carry trade has already been unwound, and that there was also no foreign exposure to this carry trade. So that's a healthy thing. It's not going to be re-levered, but to me, when everybody talks about the capital outflow story from China, this is what the outflow is. And to me, it's much less damaging. It's not like foreign direct investment is leaving China. It is this carry trade is unwinding, which had been a one-way bet, but it also does point to China's problem. They're going to show weaker corporate profits as they move to this services model. So taking a look now at fiscal policy in China, like how much room is there to be truly expansionary? I would argue there's not that much room. The fiscal adjustment in China has been notable, and that includes initiatives to actually help them manage some of their debt burden. Further expansion of the local government debt swap program, lowering the startup equity requirements for local government investment, increasing some of the quasi-fiscal support through the policy banks. But you've also seen the 6th policy rate cut since last November, last week, and also cuts to the reserve requirements. But I think you're constrained in how much more they can do because the capital outflows have been big. So August 11th, after China devalued, they had about 130 billion of capital outflows in August alone. That's the highest on record. And in September, it was 120 billion. Again, I think it's this carry trade unwinding and that is actually a positive thing over the longer term, but I still think you're only at the halfway mark. China, I believe, will continue the growth stabilizing measures. And if they are truly to address this corporate debt problem, they're going to need to take a number of different measures. They're going to have to look at the tax and fee burden cuts for the corporate sector. They're going to have to keep interest rate policy accommodative. They're going to have some growth stabilizing measures to avoid a collapse in domestic demand, and they're going to have to address the state-owned enterprises as well. And the state-owned enterprises continue to underperform. Industrial profits in the state-owned sector actually fell about 25% in the month of August, if you look at the latest read. And by comparison, though, if you look at other parts of China, you didn't have this kind of read at all. The industrial profits for joint stock companies were down only 1.7%. For foreign companies, they actually rose by 0.7%, and for private companies, they rose by 7%. So it's part of this rebalancing, but we are still in an adjustment. The focus is on energy demand, but a couple of macro trends that we would point to. We do see a divergent path between oils and metal prices going forward. We have metals prices coming down another 10 to 20%, whereas we think that oil prices on the margin will go up a little bit from here. We retain the view that OPEC agreement is highly unlikely, but we're looking at oil in our forecast for 2016 at $52.50 for Brent, $46.50 for WTI, but more downside on the metal side. And those forecasts a little bit hard to see on this chart, so let me just move on. But one thing I would say is just back of the envelope, just as every 1 percentage point decrease in Chinese growth has meant about half a percentage point off of global growth, every 1 percentage point decrease in Chinese growth has usually historically meant about 6.6% depreciation of commodity currencies. And this seems to be priced in on the energy side, but not on the metal side. The metal currencies are really tracking official Chinese growth, whereas you've had much more discounted off of the energy commodity currencies. I've outlined our forecasts, and maybe I will just finish with one last chart that goes through just the oil prices that are being assumed in the budget by emerging markets countries, and then what we, in comparison, think is the break-even price. So many countries have brought down the price assumption in their 2015 budget. I mean, you can see Algeria all the way down to $37. Angola, Gabon, how much they've brought down prices. But you can see that there's a huge variation. I mean, oil price assumptions in the budget are anywhere from $35 to $70. Now, if you take a look at the break-even price, though, there are still many countries that we're really counting on a much higher price, where we think the fiscal break-even is much higher, where they're going to have to compensate for that elsewhere. So this will remain a drag on the emerging markets growth outlook. We do have slightly better emerging markets recovery next year, but still below potential. 3.7% growth is still about a full percentage point below potential. So again, it is one where there are a lot of differences this time around. First, there's the foreign exchange reserves. Emerging markets have about 10 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. That provides a huge cushion. I mean, if you think about it, when you read all of these reports, is emerging markets corporates the next bubble? They talk about 3.5 trillion of emerging markets borrowing. The two things that they're missing in that analysis, in my opinion, are the following. Half of the borrowing is quasi-sovereign. So it's been, Petrobras, and half of the growth has been China. And this is why it's very different than developed market financial crises. There isn't this whole question of bailout and will the government be there? Will they let Lehman go? Will TARP pass the Congress? Will there be a Greek exit? Nobody's really questioning that China is going to support its state-owned enterprises or that Brazil supports Petrobras. And you have a lot of foreign exchange reserves. So this is what I would describe as a slow bleed. It's a slow bleed that could last quite a while with slower growth, but it's not the type of insolvency boom-bust cycle that we've seen in emerging markets before.
Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank Sarah and CSIS for their kind invitation to speak about a topic, a very interesting topic near and dear to my heart this morning. And it's really good to see, to have an opportunity to speak next to Joyce and Catherine, and good to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So, I'm going to be talking a bit, cover some of the similar ground that Joyce spoke about, but also try to tie it more into the impact this has had on commodity and particularly energy producers, and what this, what the outlook is for producer strategy and also for emerging market demand going forward. So, we've already talked about the China rebalancing. This is not, I'm sure, a familiar story to all of you, where China's growth model is shifting from one driven by fixed asset investment into one that's more balanced and driven by consumption. So it's not just a slowing of the Chinese economy, but a shifting of the engines of Chinese growth. This has had a dramatic impact on the commodity complex. And it's not just an oil or an energy story. It's across all the commodities, really, including base metals and agricultural commodities. This chart here, I'm trying to capture the impact that this China rebalancing has had on the various kind of major commodity exporters. So it's a little bit of a busy chart, but it's basically capturing the economic impact between what we're actually seeing and a hypothetical world where China continued to grow on its pre-rebalancing phase. And there's some obvious usual suspects like Australia, like Mongolia, but you also see a lot of the major energy producers, Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Russia, etc., all being quite strongly impacted by China rebalancing. And this is actually happening even as oil is one of the less impacted of the commodities. You're actually seeing this divergent impact between weaker Chinese demand for diesel and distillate, but at the same time, fairly robust demand for gasoline as Chinese households continue to emerge. Focusing now more specifically on the oil producers, and also on the consumers, you see here estimates of the impact of a $50 decline in oil prices onto all of these various energy producers and consumers. And I think one takeaway is that the impact is really asymmetric. There are producers that are quite dramatically hurt because of the importance of petroleum production and exports on their economy. And while, of course, this also has a fairly positive impact on the consumers, since after all, this is a major transfer of wealth from producers to consumers, the relatively large and diversified nature of the U.S., China, India, et cetera, means that the gains that they gain are relatively small in proportional terms. Now, focusing more specifically on the producers, Joyce already talked about the oil break-even prices. I think all break-even price estimates need to be taken with a bit of salt. There's a lot of moving parts that goes inside the calculation of a break-even price. But nevertheless, rather than focusing so much on the absolute level, I think it is a useful metric to capture kind of relative vulnerability between producers. And you can see countries like Nigeria, Venezuela, Russia are relatively more exposed to a lower price environment from a fiscal position perspective. And there are some countries like Qatar or Kuwait or UAE that are relatively resilient. So we're seeing this emergence of relative winners and losers, not just among the producers versus consumers, but even among the producers. I would argue that we're starting to see a spectrum between those producers that are relatively have healthy fiscal reserves and foreign reserves, or have borrowing resiliency and capability to borrow to meet any shortfalls, versus those countries that were really living hand to mouth and are in a very difficult position from lower prices. Going forward, are we going to see any relief? That's, we can speak a whole session about this, but at least at the moment, since the first dramatic price declines in November of last year, we've really seen production from the world continue to remain very robust. With the U.S. Continuing to grow, Saudi Arabia, of course, continuing to grow, even Russia being flat to up. So there does seem to be, as you all know, this race for market share, and we may need more time before we start seeing the price elasticity of supply start kicking in. This, and it's not just on the supply side, but this has an interesting, I would argue, effect on demand as well. So of course, in the past decade, from 2000 to 2010, emerging markets, in particular China, have been spearheading increases in global oil demand growth. But actually, I would argue that one of the big surprises was the strong demand from the Middle East and from energy producers. It's this positive feedback effect as higher oil prices meant very strong economic growth, which meant a fairly robust energy demand. And now that feedback loop is happening in the other direction. With lower oil prices meeting, I would say, a much a softer outlook for energy demand from Middle East producers, at the same time as China, of course, is also slowing and rebalancing. So the traditional engines of oil demand growth are shifting in this new decade. We still, of course, expect to see emerging markets pick up the slack, even as OECD countries see their demand actually fall due to things in improvements in energy efficiency and so on that Catherine will, I'm sure, be talking about shortly. But Joyce talked about some of the more negative outlooks for Brazil and for Russia. I think we would agree at State that we're not facing a 1997 style full-blown systemic crisis, because after all, we are now many emerging markets have much stronger foreign reserve positions, and they're not as tied to fixed exchange rate regimes like they used to. But we are going through a new phase of slower growth, partially thanks to the ripple effects through the commodity complex. And this definitely should have an impact on emerging market energy demand going forward. All right. Thanks very much.
just for 3 slides. Yeah. Got an extra hour this weekend. There. That's great. All right, thank you. And like the other speakers, I want to thank CSIS for inviting me to speak. I'm going to shift a bit from quarters to decades, talk about longer-term growth. Also shift a bit from China to sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to be talking about some research that I've done in Kenya, which is really kind of the leader in terms of growth in sub-Saharan Africa. But just to start, I wanted to summarize where in the world electricity is being used. So this is a picture of the world at night, and I think really highlights where people are using electricity. So I'm from California. You can take the California perspective and note that you can really see LA and the Bay Area highlighted there. You can see the eastern seaboard, kind of DC blends together with New York with all the big cities there. In Europe, you can see London, Birmingham, Madrid, Rome, and then you can see the rest of the world. So looking at this and focusing on the developed world, it really seems like you can see where the population centers are. You can see where people are living. So this is where people are actually living. For instance, look at sub-Saharan Africa, where the population density per square kilometer is about the same as the eastern US. And you can see that the areas, northern states in India, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Pakistan, Bangladesh, areas there where there's a lot of population density. And then when you superimpose the lights on the people, you can really see the difference between the developing world and the developed. You can see that the areas in sub-Saharan Africa where there are a lot of people, but just not much electricity consumption. Similarly, the areas that I highlighted in northern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, where there are a lot of people, but really not much electricity consumption. So one thing that this highlights is the strong correlation between electricity consumption and economic development. So you can see lots of electricity consumption in the developed world, not so much in the developing. And that's something that shows up in the data, just a very strong correlation between electricity and economic development. I think the other thing this highlights is that this is very likely to change. There are lots of people coming out of poverty, and they're going to start using energy. And so that's something that I've devoted a lot of my research time to studying. So here's a way to put numbers on it. The straight lines here are actual energy consumption, and here I've shifted from electricity to all energy. So this is, adding together electricity, oil, natural gas, making it quads of energy. The dotted lines are the projections. And so if you look over the next 25 years, the EIA is forecasting that growth in energy consumption in the developing world will be 5 times as high as growth in the developed world. I actually have some work that I think suggests that the EIA is, if anything, underestimating the growth potential in the developing world, that there'll be more than this growth potential. So given that growth, I wanted to make 3 comments. One is that I think the rising middle classes are playing a strong role in driving this energy growth, and I'll explain why that is. So given that growth and the potential for climate change, I think it's attractive to think about the role of solar. But I want to be a little bit negative here and suggest that I don't think that solar is the cure-all that it's often laid out to be. That I think, solar makes us think that we can solve climate change and have economic development driven by energy at the same time, but I think that there are reasons to temper that optimism. The third point that I want to make is that institutions are important. Anyone who studies the developing world knows that this is the case, but I want to give a couple examples. Okay, so first, in terms of the rising middle class, let's just focus first on one of these graphs. They basically show the same relationship. So this is from some work that I've done in Mexico, and what this is plotting is on the horizontal axis, that's annual expenditures per person at the household level. So think of that basically as a summary measure of the household's wealth. It's kind of how much they're spending per person.
It's measured in logs, and what that means is that every kind of equal-sized movement along that axis represents the same percent change. What's on the vertical axis is the share of households that have a refrigerator. So that's the blue line that's plotted there. And what's really notable is the distinct S shape in that line. And so what that means is if your household wealth goes up by a certain percentage amount at the very far left of the curve, your propensity, the likelihood that you own a refrigerator doesn't change by that much. So if you go from being extremely poor to just very poor, you probably consume more calories, and you're not buying a refrigerator. But then there's a real inflection point. And so think of this as the rising middle class. People come out of poverty and they buy a refrigerator. People come out of poverty, eventually they buy a washing machine. They buy things that use energy. And so this is kind of a summary of what happens to energy consumption as people come out of poverty. They start using things like refrigerators. Not only does that use energy at their home when they plug it in, but they become part of the cold chain, and getting them cold stuff requires that the food is manufactured in a cold factory, and that it's transported in trucks that are cold. And so we think that this relationship that you're seeing in refrigerators really summarizes what happens with the rising middle class in terms of energy consumption. So this is Mexico in 1996. The red line plots where the households are in Mexico, or where they were in 1996, then again where they are in 2008. And what you're seeing is that the population kind of shifted through that inflection point. So by 2008, the modal household at the peak of that red line was about 80% likely to own a refrigerator, whereas in 1996, it was only about 50% likely to own a refrigerator. And what we think is happening is that there are a bunch of households in the developing world, in Indonesia and India, not so much in China, because China has to a great extent kind of moved through that inflection point, but in sub-Saharan Africa, that are poised to become energy consumers. So here's a more macro perspective, but on the same point. So here we're plotting on the horizontal axis kind of the growth, the change in log of GDP per capita. And then on the vertical axis, we're plotting the change in the energy consumption. And I'm distinguishing between countries that have had pro-poor growth, those are the ones in red, and countries without pro-poor growth. So think of countries with pro-poor growth as countries that are really shifting people through the inflection points, shifting people from poverty into the middle class. Countries without pro-poor growth, maybe the growth is going to the rich, and the rich already have refrigerators. The rich are already using a lot of energy. And so what you see in this graph is if you make that distinction between countries, the countries with pro-poor growth in the red, the relationship between their GDP growth and their energy growth is twice as tight as for the countries without the pro-poor growth. And so in the countries with pro-poor growth, as they're bringing people into the middle class, a unit of GDP translates into 2 times as much energy consumption as in the countries without pro-poor growth. So I think, again, this speaks to the role of the rising middle class. So seeing this, I really wanted to understand the rising middle class, and in part, this brought me to Kenya, where we noticed that there are about 30% of the households in the country that are connected to the electricity grid. And so one thing we wanted to do is understand what happened to a household when they got electricity. Did their kids study more at night? Did they buy a refrigerator first or a TV first? Or what happened to their energy consumption? What happened to their lives? In order to do this study, we wanted to identify households that didn't have electricity in their house yet, but to whom we could subsidize their access to electricity. And then we had a control group that was very similar, where we didn't subsidize their access to electricity. What we noticed is represented in this figure. So let me explain what this figure does. At the middle of the figure is an electricity transformer. Kenya has had a massive rural electrification push with the aim of electrifying schools and public health centers. And so the transformer there is presumably electrifying a nearby school. What it means, though, is so that the circles are all households, and if they're green, they don't have electricity. If they're yellow, they do have electricity. And what we're seeing is that they're households without electricity that are right next to the existing infrastructure. Literally, they could throw a rock from their house and hit the transformer. And so often in discussions of the electricity issue in the world, you hear statistics like 1.3 billion people live without electricity in their house. And often this is said as 1.3 billion people are off the grid. And to me, that connotes that people are far away from the grid, that there's a kind of a technological problem that we need to fix. We need to bring the grid to them. But what we're seeing is that describing these people as off-grid really isn't right. They don't have electricity in their house, but they're right next to the infrastructure. So it's probably not a technological problem. It's probably kind of a socioeconomic problem. How do we make electricity affordable to them? So in Kenya, the connection cost, the cost of getting Kenya Power to run the line to your house is $400, which is about half the average national income. So, that's just tons and tons of money for people. So we think that the problem is not so much technological, but is lowering the connection price. I think the other point that this makes, though, is that these people aren't off-grid, and bringing them solar is not necessarily, from kind of a techno-economic perspective, the cheapest way to bring electricity to these homes. The grid is right there. Let's just extend the grid. So this is one part of rural Kenya. We have 150 transformers like this, and we've done similar mapping. And on average, we've noted that within 600 meters of transformers, 95% of the people don't have electricity. So this is one example, but the pattern bears out. So this is something that the Center for Global Development put out, we think, after our study and using our terminology, this idea of people being under-grid. And so they're pointing out that in the 5 original Power Africa countries, the majority of the people who aren't connected to the grid in all the countries but Tanzania are actually under the grid and not off-grid. So they're mapping people within 1 kilometer of the electricity grid. I've seen other work in Nigeria that suggests that 99% of the people who aren't connected would be most economically connected to the grid as opposed to some kind of solar solution. Tanzania is an exception, although Tanzania we think of as about 10 years behind Kenya in terms of rural electrification. They're also starting a new rural electrification program to bring the grid to the schools, so I think that undergrid number in Tanzania is likely to go up. The other reason that I'm not so bullish on solar solutions is summarized by this picture. This is a picture of the most popular solar home system that's available in Kenya. What you do is you pay about a 3,000 Kenyan shilling deposit. That's about $40 roughly. And then you pay $50 a day, and you get this system here. The thing that I want you to notice about this system is that it provides 8 watts of power. So think about your incandescent light bulb. That's maybe 60, maybe 100 watts. You would need like 10 of these to power an incandescent light bulb. So you can't really think of this as bringing electricity to a house. It's bringing very, very limited electricity. You would need, we interviewed people in Kenya and asked them what they wanted to do with their electricity. The number 3 asset that they wanted to power was an iron. An iron uses like 1,500 watts. And so you would need hundreds of these to power an iron. So this is a step, but it's not really driving economic development in the way that grid power will. So the other point that I want to make is about institutions. And here, I don't know if you can see this, but this is a picture of one of the homes that we subsidized to have electrified in Kenya. And sometimes people talk about the last mile program. So that's the image that I want you to think about with the undergrid idea, that we just need to extend the grid, less than a mile to people. Well, here's an example of like the last 2 inches problem. This is a live wire. The white box there is called a ready board. That's what people screw their light bulbs into and can charge cell phones on, but the wire is not connected to the white box. And so this, it turns out, was a contractor that had relationships to the government, and was not doing a very good job. They brought the wire there, they just didn't connect it the last 2 inches. So an example of, I think corruption involved, as I said, the contractor had a relationship with the government and wasn't very closely monitored, but a potential problem in terms of extending the grid. The other thing that we've seen is summarized in this chart here. So just look at the top. We're plotting the days it takes between when people were offered by our research team a connection to the grid and when they actually got a connection to the grid. And so you see there's that long, what we're calling waiting period, A3, when they'd already paid, they'd already gotten their Kenya Revenue Authority kind of wiring certificate, but then they just waited. They waited on average half a year between when they were ready for the electricity and when the electricity actually showed up. And not all of that time was spent with contracting or with construction. A lot of that time was just the infrastructure was actually there, but Kenya Power hadn't shown up to do the metering. And so this is another example of weak institutions. So we think this suggests, and tying this back to the rising middle class, that there'll be this strong demand for energy as people come out of poverty and start using things, or start having the income to use things like refrigerators, but governments really need to step up their game and develop the institutions that can bring the energy services to people.
Great.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, that's a great sort of tour de force. We've gone from sort of the large sort of macro picture all the way down to the micro. I want to start off with two similar questions that each of you can address, because you both have talked about energy prices and the price dynamic and how it feeds into your overarching outlook, but you've also talked about policies. And so in sort of the point of this entire event, which is to look at how emerging markets and the outlook for sort of their growth affects energy demand, how does the current structure, if we do find ourselves in a structural environment where low prices for oil are lower for longer, and I mean beyond sort of the period in time where at the end of next year people think there'll be sort of a market rebalancing, but for some reason you don't see the supply elasticities that everybody's expecting, nobody's really letting up on the gas pedal, and the $1.5 trillion that are coming off the board in investment just don't materialize as quickly as people think. If you've got this lower for longer oil price environment, how does that feed into some of the trends that each of you talked about? Similarly, if you do see something like an oil supply disruption or you see some other sort of interruption in the marketplace, how would a high price environment sort of affect some of the major trends that you're evaluating and seeing? And then similarly, you all talked about the policy environment. Joyce, in particular, you talked about the Chinese policy environment and the Fifth Plenum announcements. There is a very coordinated and discernible effort going on out there to detach GDP from energy intensity in more and more aggressive ways, whether it's through oil consumption or particularly kinds of energy consumption, or just the relationship itself. And so where do you see in the world that you look at those policies actually having an important effect, and where do you think that they're really just not severe enough to have those kinds of constraints or change the way that you see trends evolving? So maybe, Joyce, if we could start with you and we'll go down the line.
I think it's still early days with the policies, but I think the biggest thing is, are you beginning to see a lot of the subsidies being removed on oil prices? And we haven't actually seen a lot of progress with this in many of the countries that have the most intensive subsidies. So like in Nigeria, Venezuela, have the biggest subsidies, but we've seen fuel subsidies in Indonesia, for example. So I think that the key thing that a lot of policymakers are looking at is whether they can actually provide, sustain these subsidies from a fiscal perspective. I think it's early to say because you had oil that was still well over $100, a little over a year ago, to say that you can really measure what the impact is. But I'd say the first policy steps would be the the subsidies. The second would be, your incentives for investment. And I think Mexico is a good example where the first round of their oil auctions really didn't go very well. It had taken them decades to actually pass the energy reform, and then they modified the second set of auctions so that they could actually get more investment in. But some of this will be how are you going to have to incentivize investment to come into your country, particularly when I think many people had underestimated the technological advances with shale, that you could cut costs and still keep production up. And this means that and on top of that, you have that there's a number of areas where you can talk about the investment into oil, but the security situation is just not making that possible. So many of our forecasts look at how much you could increase production in places like Iraq and Iran, but you really hit a bottleneck to be able to hit higher capacity until the security issues can be addressed. So I'd say the subsidies are one on the sort of demand and cost side. The incentives for investment are another, as far as like how much in investment dollars you can get in as well.
So first on what the lower for longer type scenario, which I think we also subscribe to, might mean for kind of the broader outlook. I already discussed how there is this asymmetry between the impact on producers and the impact on consumers, and therefore there are definitely certain producers to be watching closely to see whether they can handle the stress of a long period of lower prices below their budgetary assumptions and their expectations. And this has an effect not just on the direct revenue, but also on capital investment and so on, as Joyce mentioned. In terms of the benefit to consumers, they're definitely real. And therefore, this is providing a fillip to the global economy. But I think it's important not to overestimate that effect, partially because it looks, there's, I think, some evidence that suggests that consumers are putting this into savings instead of into consumption, perhaps because they're skeptical about how long-lasting this is going to be, but also because the recent oil price decline is absolutely not just a supply effect as well. It's happening on the demand side as well, as all of us have talked about, and so the improvements in that we've made in energy efficiency, and to see this long-term downward trend in OECD oil demand, for example, is ironically mitigating the economic benefits of a lower oil price regime. Granted, when I see things like how the Ford F-150 is the best-selling car in America again, that the spectrum is again changing, but at least for the moment, there does seem to be some of the mitigants. So really, the big question is whether we can translate this temporary relief and just see it all disappear into savings, or whether we can actually translate this into broader structural reform and needed investments in both infrastructure as well as structural reforms to change our long-term global potential rate. And as Joyce said, we are seeing heartening progress in places like Mexico, like Indonesia, like India, like UAE, where they do seem to be understanding this as not just a short-term economic injection of adrenaline, but actually a more conducive environment for tackling things like fossil fuel subsidies.
To answer your first question about prices driving demand. Your pressure button. Okay. Yeah, to answer the first question about how prices will drive demand, I think especially over the long run, I know this probably sounds hypocritical for an economist to say this, but I don't think prices will be the major driver. I think two factors were, I talked about income and how rising incomes will drive people to acquire things that use energy, that will really shift them into kind of the energy using world. And don't just think from that perspective about people plugging in appliances at home and using appliances at home. That's one driver of a rising middle class for energy. But you also, if you buy a car, you start using roads, and the roads need to be paved. If you buy a refrigerator, you start going to the supermarket, and the supermarket uses more energy than you would have as a subsistence farmer. So I really think that this kind of demographic income-driven shift will be an important driver of long-run demand. The other thing that I didn't mention, although I do think is important, Joyce referred to this, is demographics. So sub-Saharan Africa, the average person in sub-Saharan Africa is something like 25 years old. And there's really going to be this demographic-driven growth in GDP. I think I'm not an expert in this realm, and it's probably too early to tell, but the repeal of the one-child policy in China may drive eventual energy demand there. As far as decoupling GDP and energy growth, I'm not that optimistic for the reasons that I'm talking about, the idea of the rising middle class, that we will successfully decouple GDP from energy growth.
Joyce, I wanted to pull back onto something that you had said, which was sort of describing what's happening in emerging markets as a slow bleed as opposed to some sort of collapse or hard landing. You did express a lot of optimism in service-led growth within China, but then also service sector-led growth within China, but then also this perspective that a lot of other emerging economies aren't going to be living up to their growth potential. Are you starting to see some dynamics in those other countries where they're starting to respond to that perception that their growth isn't living up to its potential, and they're trying to institute reforms to try and get around that? And do you have any optimism on that side? And similarly, do you have any pessimism about the service sector-led growth in China?
Well, look, I think the structural reforms post-global financial crisis, whether it's a developed market or an emerging market, they have not happened quickly. And even to the success stories like India, there has not been a lot of structural reform yet. I mean, there's been talk about what they will do. So I would not overestimate, how quickly that any of these countries, whether it is, a developed market or an emerging markets, can actually do some of the more meaningful structural reforms. So what we have seen so far is which countries have the scope to do 2 or 3 macro policy events. The first is just ease policy. And we have seen, that inflation in emerging markets countries, inflation has been the dog that hasn't barked. It's a problem in certain areas, but it's the first time that we're seeing inflation actually below the target for many emerging markets countries, just as we've seen deflationary pressures in the developed markets. So you only have South Africa, Turkey, and Brazil, which are above the inflation target right now, which is very unusual in emerging markets. So we've seen monetary policy easing. Even with that, though, we've seen tighter financial conditions, though. So you haven't had all of those effects play out. We've seen some, fiscal expansionary policies, as well in these countries. But I think what you're going to have to see is more restructuring of some of the state-owned enterprises and some of the private sectors. So for oil and gas in Brazil, for example, you're going to have to see more M&A activity that will be about consolidating the oil and gas sectors, companies in those sectors, so that they can survive. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be about bringing all of these IPOs to market as everybody would have thought a few years ago. The same thing, the problem in China will be how they restructured a lot of their state-owned enterprises. So I think more than sort of structural reforms, it will be like what type of corporate restructuring will be forthcoming. And emerging markets is different because when you talk about this buildup of emerging markets corporate debt, half of it is quasi-sovereign. So it's called private sector credit, but if you look at Brazil, like 65% of their debt has been Petrobras. Mm-hmm. And Petrobras is now the largest fallen angel in history. It's actually surpassed General Motors. And and then half of the growth has also been China, which is not a normal private sector economy either. So it's about how they proceed with that restructuring of the state-owned enterprises. So I do think that actually China has made quite a lot of progress over 2 or 3 years in moving to something that's more services oriented. But they also will need to put into place a social safety net because of their demographics and the population becoming more elderly. that's still, they will have other costs to come that they also need to incorporate as their demographics, are shifting less favorably as far as just looking at the overall labor supply. So I think countries are starting they're starting with macro policies first, because those are ones that you can take at a top-down level. I think the tougher structural reforms, still remain, politically difficult in so many countries, including the United States, Europe, and Japan, for that matter. And the one thing that you have seen every emerging markets country do is really allow the currency to weaken. And I ran a conference recently around the IMF World Bank meetings, and you sit through 40 of these presentations, and virtually every present started with, even though we haven't done structural reforms, at least we've let our currency adjust. So that, is a dilemma for the U.S. I mean, the stronger dollar has meant that it's the first time that we're seeing export earnings go. And you talk to companies in the U.S., even the benefits of lower oil prices in many ways are being offset by, the stronger dollar. That's the number one concern as I talk to a lot of the U.S. multinational corporations.
Catherine or Daniel, did you want to add anything to that? I would add one of the things you said, Joyce, which is interesting. We had an event here last week focusing on Nigerian corruption reform and the role of an NPC and that sort of thing. And what we're noticing that's interesting in a lot of these economies is that you do have, to the extent that there is pseudo-structural reform being undertaken or some sort of reform being undertaken, being coupled with this idea of rooting out corruption, right? You have that phenomenon in China, you've got the phenomenon in Nigeria, you've got that in Brazil and several other places. Is that something you spend any time focusing on, Daniel, in your work, or Catherine in your work as well? And what do you think about that as sort of the places that are trying to get at that more sort of bottom-up sort of structural reform through a corruption lens as having some prospect of success or impact?
Yeah, I'm relatively optimistic about the ability for civil society to root out corruption. And I think the reason I am is because of just the proliferation of things like the internet and cell phones. And so the ability for somebody to, immediately report when their electricity goes out by tweeting Kenya Power, or for them to immediately, report corruption that they're seeing on the ground is that much more powerful. So as I say, I think I'm relatively optimistic for that reason, that the corruption will be kind of seen and reported and broadcast on the internet by members of civil society. We haven't seen it happen that much yet, but I think the room for growth is there.
Yeah, I would second a lot of what was said earlier, in the sense that, in terms of the three kind of big buckets by which policymakers can address our, new mediocre, as Christine Lagarde would say, for the economic outlook, fiscal, monetary, and structural. The monetary has been the one lever, the one arrow by which we've tried to get everything done. But as Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen would say, you can't just be a one-trick pony, and we do need progress on the fiscal side and on the structural side, despite all of the political resistance to this. That said, I don't think it's all doom and gloom either. We talked earlier about the progress we've seen in tackling something like fossil fuel subsidies. Another initiative I would highlight is TPP, which is really not just a trade agreement, a classic trade agreement, but if you strip away the trade components of it, it is an extraordinary document for environmental standards, for labor standards, for state investor disputes, and for SOE reform as well. And so, this is something that the administration is putting forth as a exemplar of an alternative approach a rules-based approach toward long-term economic, the realization of long-term economic potential, away from the more statist, mercantilist, return of the old state capitalism approach, and hopefully serves as a direction for the future. We've already been seeing at state a lot of enthusiasm in many countries. The president of Indonesia came out and said, we want to be a part of this. This can hopefully have a snowballing effect on many emerging markets.
Any other thoughts on the trade agenda and its impact on emerging markets? I'm going to open it up for questions. Please wait for the microphone. Oh, my microphone. Please wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation and question. The form of a question. We'll start with Susanna over here.
Hi, thanks very much, Sarah, for putting this together. Thank you to Joyce, Daniel, and Catherine. Susanna Choi with Aramco. This is a question specifically for Joyce. In the context of everything that you've said during your presentation, the slow bleed, the commodities prices being lower for longer, how are investors, how are portfolio managers positioning themselves? How are they thinking about the market?
So I think that what we've seen is that for if you just take a look at capital flows this year, you've had $57 billion of outflows out of emerging markets equities, and you've had outflows out of emerging markets FX, but hard currency, emerging markets borrowing in dollars, which has been largely a quasi-sovereign story, flows have actually been flat. So you've had some strategic inflows going in, you've had some retail money coming out, and flat is not, may sound bad, but U.S. high-grade bonds have had about 30 billion of outflows, which a lot of people haven't really looked at because there's 1 trillion of supply in the market. But you're beginning to see in the U.S. dollar markets that the flows are turning more negative. We estimate that out of U.S. equities, you probably saw 200 to 300 billion of outflows in August and September. It's the first year of outflows from U.S. corporate bonds since the global financial crisis. So in emerging markets, I would say it's a disconnect between dollar debt and understanding that the emerging markets countries are solvent this time around versus the holding anything affiliated with the local currency, which has been the shock absorber. And when people ask me what kind of crisis this is in emerging markets, it's not 98 and it's not 2003 in Brazil either. The FX has been the shock absorber. And in many cases, for the countries where they don't have a fiscal anchor, they're going to have to overshoot on the currency side. So in the case of Brazil, we still have the currency a year out at 4.35. We have it going weaker, even though we think that fair value is probably in the high threes. So I think that there's a disconnect between the local markets, local currency plays in emerging markets versus the hard currency. What we don't see is an emerging markets corporate default rate that's really going to rise that quickly. So we have emerging markets high yield corporate default this year at about 4.3%, which is, and even for China, looking at the peak for non-performing loans, including the shadow banking system, we have that peaking at about 8.2%. These are higher numbers, but they're not crisis numbers. And so I think the difference is that it isn't the type of boom-bust cycle we've seen, but the adjustment valve has been the currency. And you've also had this cushion with the foreign exchange reserves. But you also have the growth elsewhere is also much lower than it had been, previously. So emerging markets has not been able to escape that. That's sort of the story of the global financial crisis. So how are investors, positioning on this? It's gone back to feeling more like it's people who are dedicated to emerging markets. That a lot of the crossover investors, they can look at high yield energy companies in the U.S. right now. But the one thing I would say is that all of the QE policies have meant that companies can borrow more cheaply and at longer duration. So we don't see a real rollover risk anywhere. So even if you say that, oh, is the credit cycle very mature, the rollover problem is just really not the problem. I mean, many emerging markets were issuing, century bonds at very low coupons. And so even for the US high yield market, which is 30% energy, I mean, we have a high yield default rate this year that's about 1.5%, rising to 3% next year. I mean, these are much lower than what we have seen over, at different points over the last decade. So I think the fears that there's a bubble that's about to burst, and be an unanticipated surprise, are less than the sort of slow. That's less the scenario than the slow bleed that we're talking about, where it's more that there isn't necessarily a catalyst, to see how you jump from the current situation into one that's fundamentally much different.
Daniel, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd just add one other thing about investment in this new oil price environment. I think prior, when this was first happening, there was a lot of concern about what this was going to do to investment for renewables, and we have not seen a dramatic fall off in investment and rollout of renewables as many had feared, and would have been probably the first place to look at in terms of dropping capital investment. So I think it's partially a testimony to the dramatic strides that have been made in making solar, especially but also wind, much more cost effective, right? We're all the headlines have been focusing about a drop in oil prices, but actually in percentage terms, we've seen even more dramatic drops in the price for solar and for wind. It's just been happening, it's just been taking longer. So, so I would just add that we have not seen that impact on investment, which is good news.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm the president of Revoltech Energy. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I come from Kenya. Catherine, what you said is very true, and I've been talking about how do we get electricity that can be for growth and development in Africa. They talk about renewables, charging cell phones. What has cell phones to do with the development, though we have a lot of cell phones in Africa? So how do we deal with that, especially in the rural areas? I've supported the Congress on the same issue, but as you know, Power Africa is there, and we're still talking the same. How do we get into growth and development using the actual electricity, not renewable energy? And my question is also to Mr. Hans, Mr. Daniel. What are you doing, or what is the USA doing on the countries with sanctions like Russia, like Libya, when it comes to oil? If people, customers, and people like us who deal in oil, when it comes, we are stuck into those sanctions. How do you do, or what is going to happen in future with Russia, Libya, and other countries that are dealing in oil? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. How do we use energy to drive development? My own view is that there's a bit too much emphasis on rural electrification. I think poor people without energy, they have a lot of needs, and it's not clear that a grid connection is the first thing that they need. They need better access to healthcare, better education, there are lots of things. So I do think that we need to understand better the link between energy growth and industrialization, for instance. And then if you get industrialization, that drives job creation and helps the people in the rural areas. So I think it's a fantastic question. I don't know if this was part of your question, but I think there's also the question of what types of energy growth to get. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea that coal, if you leave aside the environmental challenges, is a miracle. I mean, coal is cheap, it's abundant, it's something that the developed world used to drive our economic growth. So I think it's an issue that we need to confront, that we can't insist that the developing world drive development with renewables unless we're willing to highly subsidize them.
Thank you for your question. We can spend hours talking about U.S. energy and sanction policy vis-a-vis countries. Obviously, each country in each case and each sanction is different, and they're often targeted at different things. I mean, for example, for Russia, we have been very careful to try and craft the sanctions in a way so that it's not disruptive to immediate markets and to our European allies. Of course, in Iran, we're in a different phase where we're now rolling off sanctions once implementation is achieved. I would kind of step back and just say more broadly, however, that in this new lower for longer era for oil, post shale revolution and so on, this has improved the resiliency of the United States as well as, I would argue, the entire global economy to oil price shocks. And we haven't really talked about this, but kind of hidden behind the scenes of lower oil prices is much lower spare capacity for oil production. So I think it's not inconceivable that we have short-term supply disruptions that can have magnified effects. And yet, I would say overall, we're in a more resilient position vis-a-vis oil that gives the United States and other countries more flexibility, more freedom from oil as an economic weapon of blackmail, and therefore creates the kind of conducive environment to use sanctions as a creative tool of economic statecraft.
The whole issue of the sanctions, I think that the Russian sanctions have left off some of the major oil producers. So we see more of the impact, though, that investment cannot be increased in Russia more holistically, but on some of the existing investment, it hasn't had as much of an impact. I think that everybody's looking at really what realistically, what's the timing for Iranian sanctions and how much production can come online, and also what are the capacity constraints given the infrastructure constraints.
One of the other things we hear this sort of line a lot, which I don't totally disagree with or even hugely disagree with, is this idea that a lower price environment for oil and a different supply-demand balance in the United States gives a different sort of contour around the idea of using sanctions. However, how much work, maybe either Daniel or Joyce, or I don't think, Catherine, I don't know if you do much in the sanctions realm, but have you thought about sort of the long-term nature and the incremental nature of the sanctions regime and its effect on people's perception and investment in places like Russia? So, for example, we had Vladimir Milov here last week for a few events, focusing on the Russian energy economy and the things and the contortions that they're doing to, one, sort of keep up production, but two, attract additional investment, and the sort of survivalist mentality that is sort of taking over the country to be able to survive some of that. I don't personally see a way out of the current impasse with the West and Russia, but you do have to sort of refigure and refresh some of these sanctions, at least on the European side. Do you see sort of longer term, either investment side or energy sector side implications for this idea that maybe investors and folks look at the U.S. proclivity to use sanctions and that they're vague and incremental and scalpel-like, but gosh, they're pesky, having sort of an impact on some of these emerging markets and how they view attracting investment. You hear a lot of sort of anecdotes about setting up alternative financial structures, even though that's very hard to do. What are the things that people should watch about to sort of take those things more seriously, I guess?
No, that's a very good question, and part of an ongoing debate and discussion, I would say. Stepping back, the whole approach of economic statecraft and sanctions and smart sanctions, new targeted financial sanctions, as opposed to traditional kind of broad trade embargoes, is relatively new and evolving. It kind of emerged out of success with Banco Delta Asia in North Korea, and yet as we're going through, for example, Iran, We are, in an episode now where we have to learn about how to pull back sanctions, right? So it's no longer a matter of trying to change incentives by inflicting sanctions to try and change behavior, but now pulling back sanctions to try to change behavior. And so, state and Treasury and the entire United States government is going through this learning process as well. I would like to think that as pesky as they are, some of that was, we've not had, it's become a much more fine-tuned instrument and not, a blunt instrument like we saw, for example, vis-a-vis Iraq in previous decades. But again, some of the work that I'm doing in my capacity at the State Department is looking more empirically at the impact of smart financial sanctions. There's a lot of literature kind of more broadly on it, but relatively little, I would say, on specifically looking at the impact and how to craft the actual tactics better, how to improve the dialogue between the authorities and the private sectors so as to clarify places where we want clarity and yet also keep places where we deliberately want strategic ambiguity to remain ambiguous and set expectations accordingly.
How does it affect sort of investors or perception of risk in some of the countries that you're in?
I just think as a matter of policy, I mean, when you have name-specific sanctions that are rolled out without any announcement, and then you need to figure out what the individual names own and whether they own more than 51% of it. I mean, I think it's very problematic for anyone to feel that they can genuinely, comply with that very easily because there's no forewarning on when they may come out and, they're name specific. But I think the key thing to watch right now with Russia is, under the Minsk II agreement, there are certain deadlines where they roll off. And so the ball's really in the court with the Europeans. And with everything that is going on with the refugee situation with Syria, what message will, what tact will they want to take on this particular issue? That's, I think, what everyone's waiting for next. I think the market feels that there was a period where the U.S. led with this, and then after the Malaysia Airlines after Malaysia Airlines, the two were aligned, then you had these agreements that were crafted very much led by the Germans, the Normandy format, not involving the U.S. And that's the key thing that we're looking at, that many of these deadlines actually roll off in the next couple of months. And will the sanctions be renewed? Will some of them roll off? Will they deem that some of the ceasefires have worked? So I think the next steps are actually with Europe. I think the point of view of the private sector is from the point of view of implementation. It's very hard to think of any policy where you don't know when it will be actually unveiled, and that is by name specific, and then it has certain things like, well, it has to be majority owned, so you're also then trying to figure out if it's majority owned. I mean, as a matter of practical policy, it's hard to think of precedents that have been outlined like that before.
Hi, I'm Zach Kyler, Research Associate with the Energy Program here. First of all, thank you all very much for coming. It's a great set of presentations. My question is about the possibility of migration of energy demand within the emerging markets. I mean, given that one of the main reasons for the divergence of rich and poorer countries' energy intensity was the migration of energy-intensive manufacturing to poorer countries. Is there any possibility that the same thing could happen within emerging market economies? Is the switch in China's economic growth from services to manufacturing going to be compensated by a growth in manufacturing in other emerging market economies?
I just think that technology has even changed the nature of just how much resources need to go into manufacturing, and that's a debate that we have all of the time. amongst my research group, that are the productivity, metrics right now actually picking out how much technological change has really changed what we should look at, that looking at things like the PMIs and the data that we're used to looking at doesn't necessarily fully pick it up. So I think my broader question is, how much some of these traditional metrics may have missed what has changed because of technological advances. And I think that's a bit of what happened in the commodities. I mean, people had really underestimated, what was like, what was like sort of a more permanent shift to shale, and that production actually, the technological advances meant that, you could actually, keep production going much fast, at much lower costs than anyone had anticipated. And, even though people knew that sort of intellectually, I think until the last couple of years, they really didn't understand that. And so I don't know if I would see manufacturing moving elsewhere, but whether you could just continue to have the manufacturing side becomes more automated, and related to technology, and therefore cheaper. And so the whole way in which you have to measure economic improvement, has to factor in metrics that we haven't looked at, that some of the data watching we're doing is based off of these time series we have, which really may not be as relevant as they once were.
Yeah. I would say two things. First of all, in terms of migration of manufacturing and so on, and migration and in terms of supply chain dynamics is a very complex beast, but absolutely something that we have to consider in when we're thinking about the impact on the global really supply chain. Many of these countries are going through these different phases in their economic development, right? And so absolutely there's an argument to be made that as China is switching away from a more labor-intensive manufacturing-driven economy to a more of a service economy, it has passed that peak where its energy intensity is starting to decline, but at the same time perhaps shifting more of that activity to places like Bangladesh or Vietnam, just to name some countries which are understood to be picking up some of the slack that China, with its higher now cost of labor, may no longer be doing as intensively. But that's sort of on the manufacturing side, but I think I wholeheartedly agree with Sarah, kind of in the longer term, not Sarah, Catherine, sorry, in the longer term, where this is not just an industrial manufacturing story, it's really about the rise of the rest and the rise of the middle class. And demand is really driven, maybe not so much on the oil side of things, but really just on broader energy demand and on power demand and on coal or natural gas or renewables or whatever will be the power sources of the future. That's where the real kind of story lies.
So this is tangential to your question, but since you mentioned migration, I just wanted to riff on that question. So another strong trend that you see in emerging markets is migration to urban centers, so urbanization. And I think that will affect energy demand. For one thing, people will be coming from areas where they haven't used energy to areas where energy is more available. The other thing is, you see these statistics about cities in the emerging markets compared to cities in the developed world. So, for instance, I saw recently that Chennai has something like 3 times as many cooling degree days. It's just hotter, and so the demand for air conditioning, for energy use, will be really, really high. 3 times as many as Miami, which we think of as a very hot city in the US, and like 5 times as many people. So I think that's likely to be a strong driver of energy demand. Right now in India, only 6 million, in a country with over 1 billion people, there are only 6 million people with air conditioners, and that's definitely going to change as we go forward.
And just, sorry, just one other or 2 other quick notes on that. This, stepping away from energy for a bit, I would say one wild card to be looking at is additive manufacturing. Joyce talked about automation, but I think that could potentially be one of the most transformative things for commodity demand going forward. It was extraordinary how, when you make a widget, instead of carving it out of a big slab of metal, you can layer it, and this can reduce metallic demand for manufacturing by 90% or more, right? Whether it's going to meet all the incredible hype that's surrounding 3D printing, I don't know, maybe not. But we should always understand that the landscape for technology is always changing as well, and this could have very dramatic effects on commodity demand, including energy. Just one other quick thing. Catherine, I keep saying Sarah. Catherine talked about the migration to urban centers and also about heating degree days. I think how energy demand will evolve as we confront climate change will change, and not just from policies needed to address the problem of climate change, but also as nevertheless, even in best case scenarios, as the climate gets hotter and evolves, we're not just talking about hotter climates, we're talking about much more volatile weather, and that may have a very different structural impact upon energy demand than what we're traditionally used to.
Thanks. Andrew Dowdy, consultant. I had a question really for Catherine, and looking at some of your Africa studies, which I find very interesting. We've looked at some of the similar things in the past. And I tend to agree with you that solar, once you get past cell phones and LED lights, particularly as you get to refrigeration, the leap in electricity consumption jumps up. So I don't see that solar is going to be an easy solution. At the same time, one of the big problems we're having with the undergrid in Africa is we have totally dysfunctional utilities. I mean, the utilities that I've worked on in Africa can't collect tariffs. The governments won't allow them to impose cost-reflective tariffs. The people that are on the grid may only have electricity 10 or 12 hours a day. So I guess the question is there something, is there some sort of distributed power model that emerges, or do we wait for the utilities to become functional? And how long will that take? I mean, I'm sort of, like your sort of, crystal ball. How does Africa evolve in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, those are really good questions. And my thinking is going along much the same lines as yours is, that I think the ideal scenario is that the solar private sector NGO providers provide pressure on, kind of competitive pressure on the state-owned government monopolies and improve performance, drive them to improve their performance. Otherwise, they go out of business. I think that's the optimistic model, but I think there's some chance that works. I also, and I guess on that theme, you hear these statistics about people getting power for only 10 to 12 hours a day. We've seen in Kenya that the transformer will go down for 5 weeks. So people have no power for 5 weeks. Maybe they'll average 10 to 12 hours a day over the year, but you just can't have a refrigerator. You can't do many of the things that you could without power for that long a period. And why it takes that long to repair the transformer, I don't know. So I think that's an important factor. I guess I did want to also mention that I don't want to disparage all solar. I think that you want to make a distinction between distributed solar and grid-scale solar. Now, we haven't seen grid-scale solar in sub-Saharan Africa, but it seems like there's potential for that.
Okay, well, I just wanted to ask you to join me in thanking Joyce and Daniel and Catherine for spending some of their time this morning. I know that you each have somewhere to get to, so we're going to keep focusing on this. I know we have spent a lot of time here thinking about how sort of the shifting engines of the global economy and policy and market structure in some of these places are going to matter more and more in the years to come and not less and less. And so hopefully this won't be the last time we have you guys back. So thank you very much for joining us.